Hello everyone, it's Westy here, Director of Theatre for Glendon Performing Arts. Today I am going to be talking to you about how to act Shakespeare. We'll go through a couple of different monologues and talk about how to approach these monologues and how to act them. I know acting Shakespeare can be a really daunting thing, and it's not something we necessarily talk about a lot. So today I am going to be sharing some tips and tricks I know. To begin with, let's talk a little bit about the difference between how we act on stage today and how they would have acted on stage back then. Today, what we use most often is called the Stanislavski method. It's method acting. It's all about naturalism and making yourself into a living form of that character, living the psychology of that character. It's all about not overacting things. You want to keep things subtle but clear. There's an emphasis on the dialogue and the words that are being spoken. Acting back in the time of Shakespeare was quite a bit different. They didn't have this idea of naturalism, and there was no such thing as overacting. Most of the acting they did would have been much bigger. There was a big emphasis on body language. A lot of the lines were actually poetry. How the words flowed would tell you when to breathe and how to say them. When there were these grand monologues or soliloquies in the Shakespearean plays, it had to be interesting to watch one person stand on stage for so long. Nowadays, if you were to watch somebody just get up on stage and act naturally, it wouldn't necessarily be that interesting to watch them talk for several minutes straight. At the time, the acting through the body, the grandeur of the emotions, all of these things made it a lot more interesting and made it understandable when these characters were up there having these grand monologues. Today we're going to look at two different monologues. The first one is one from Lady Macbeth, and the second will be that famous "to be or not to be" speech that Hamlet gives. So what exactly are we going to be looking at when we're looking at these two monologues? Well, first we need to understand that there's a difference in the language. These monologues are written in iambic pentameter, like a lot of Shakespeare is. The rhythm of iambic pentameter, I'm sure you've talked about it in your English classes, goes da-dum, 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 da-dum. It is like a heartbeat. So it is 10 syllables in each line. And those syllables are broken down into the unstressed, stressed. Back and forth, a pattern like that. A lot of the time you'll also be coming across words that we don't necessarily use anymore, or words that we do still use, but we use it very differently than it was used back then. So it's very important to make sure you know what you're saying. A really helpful way to do that is to look at those No Fear Shakespeare translations offered by SparkNotes. They are super helpful, and it is definitely not cheating to look at them. I mean, even if it is cheating, I encourage you to cheat here. Another thing to acknowledge is that they would have had accents that are very, very different from how we speak now. That's why some of the rhymes and the rhyming couplets that happen at the end of scenes and acts don't always rhyme anymore in how we speak modernly. But when you are performing a Shakespeare monologue or in a Shakespeare play, you don't have to worry about that. There are some people who spend their entire lives studying what those accents would be, and they can perform in those accents. But for you, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to put on an accent to do Shakespeare. You might notice that when I do it myself, I do speak with what almost sounds like an accent, but that is just me making sure that I take my time to pronounce the words and enunciate. Enunciation is incredibly important in being understood when you are speaking these poetic phrases and using the older Shakespearean English. So, when you have to do one of these monologues, how do you approach it? How do you stop yourself from getting overwhelmed just looking at this thing? There are 4 steps that I would generally recommend taking here. The first one is context. You need to look at it in context and understand where it is in the play, what's happening around it, and all of those things. But it's also worth understanding that actors at the time would have actually only been given their own lines and no one else's. They would not know what the other people around them were saying or what else was happening in scenes that they're not in. So nowadays we have the advantage that we can look at the context and understand where it is, and that really helps us approach these scenes that we may not necessarily understand from the language alone. Second is meaning. You need to look at the meaning, specifically finding definitions for some of the words and trying to understand what it's saying in modern speech, trying to get to the point of it. If you have a physical copy of your monologue, you can use this time to highlight important words and the primary thoughts, the ideas that you're trying to get across, so that you don't get bogged down in the extra words, flourishes, and metaphors that Shakespeare tends to use. Third is reason. You need to understand why this monologue is in the play and what it's trying to say, as well as how it's trying to say it. Every speech in Shakespearean plays is an action. They play a dramatic role, they serve a dramatic function. There are no speeches, no monologues, soliloquies, there's no conversations that happen for no reason. So there is always something that is trying to be accomplished inside of that monologue. And if you can understand what it means and what the reason it's being said is, it makes it a lot easier to approach that and know how to act it. And finally, you need to look at the rhythm. What I mean by this is get in and look at the punctuation, the line breaks, the syllables, all of these things. They can give you a lot of really good hints about how you should act this monologue. So if you look at the punctuation, that's a really good hint as to when you need to breathe. You know that if you're breathing a lot, it's going to be quite a different rhythm from when there's basically no punctuation and it's just one big long sentence. So for example, commas and things are going to be short pauses, question marks means you have your rising inflection, and all of those things like that. Looking at the line breaks, you can see when sentences continue over through lines, there's not supposed to be any pauses for those line breaks. Sometimes there is punctuation at the end of a line, and that means, yeah, you're going to pause for that line break. If you look at the rhythm and count those syllables, there's supposed to be 10 syllables per line. If there are some that are shorter, that might mean something. Shakespeare's probably telling you right there in the script that you need to pause or say this differently. It's also really important to count the syllables to know how you should be pronouncing words. Some of the words that we see now would have a different number of syllables back then, and the line is not going to sound right if you don't use the right number of syllables. That's how in some of the monologues you end up with, instead of blessed, it's blessed. So sometimes there will be those like EDs that you need to pronounce, and sometimes there will be words that we would say as multiple syllables that gets shortened to fewer syllables. You'll see what I mean as we go through one of the monologues. And finally, I would say the most important thing about approaching one of these monologues is just try it. Don't be afraid. You can mess up, and it'll still be fine. This kind of thing takes a lot of practice. So give it a go, but give yourself the time to go through it, read it slowly, And again, go through and understand the context, meaning, reason, and rhythm, and it'll really help you out. So let's put this into practice. I'm going to pull up a monologue here for you. It's Lady Macbeth's monologue in Act 1, Scene 7 of Macbeth. So I am going to pull this up for you, share my screen, and you should hopefully be able to see this monologue now. I'm going to give it a quick read for you to begin with, not acting it, just saying the words. Was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself? Hath it slept since, and wakes it now to look so green and pale at what it did so freely? From this time such I account thy love. Thou afeared to be the same in thine own act and valour as thou art in desire. Wouldst thou have that which thou esteem'st the ornament of life, and live a coward in thine own esteem, letting I dare not wait upon I would, like the poor cat in the adage. So, if you're looking at this and not necessarily understanding what it's going on about, that's perfectly understandable. So, let's start by going through the context. What is the context of this scene? This scene is where Lady Macbeth is responding to her husband, Macbeth, when he hesitates. They have made a plan previously to kill Duncan. Assuming Macbeth can kill Duncan, Macbeth will become king. So, here Lady Macbeth is responding when Macbeth is hesitating to kill Duncan. Using this context, we can start to approach the meaning. To begin with, I've pulled up what No Fear Shakespeare has to say. I'm going to read to you the translation that No Fear Shakespeare provides for us. Were you drunk when you seemed so hopeful before? Have you gone to sleep and woken up green and pale in fear of this idea? From now on, this is what all think of your love. Are you afraid to act the way you desire? Will you take the crown you want so badly, or will you live as a coward, always saying, I can't, after you say, I want to? You're like the poor cat in that old story. So, now we understand this meaning. She's saying, are you so afraid to do what you said you'd do before? Are you so afraid to do the thing you really want to do? So, any words or phrases we don't understand in this, we need to look at a little bit further, using that No Fear Shakespeare translation to help us parse out the meaning of these phrases. So one that I found that I had a little bit of trouble understanding at first was, wouldst thou have that which thou esteem'st the ornament of life? If we go back and look at the No Fear Shakespeare translation, that lines up with the line, will you take the crown you want so badly? So, that which thou esteem'st the ornament of life is referring to the crown, the thing that he thinks is the most important thing in his life, the idea of being king. Another one that threw me off a little bit when I was first looking at this is that last line, like the poor cat in the adage. We know from the No Fear Shakespeare translation that it's saying, you're like the poor cat in that old story. So, we know that this is referring to a story about a hesitant or cowardly cat. Chances are this is a story that everyone in Shakespeare's time would have known about. To us, it's not overly important to know exactly which story it's referring to or exactly what that story says. It's just important that we know that it's in a similar vein as comparing somebody who lies a lot to the boy who cried wolf, but instead of for lying, it's about cowardice. It's relating Macbeth to a figure in a kind of immature children's story type thing, where we're moralizing at him and saying he's being a coward when he should not be. So if we go through this monologue and we try to highlight some of the important words and ideas that are within this monologue, we start seeing a lot of ideas come up about desire and cowardice. So we're starting to get the sense of where Lady Macbeth is going with this. She's saying, here's what you desire, and you're too cowardly to do it. We also see an idea about love coming up in there, which is an interesting thing always that tells us a bit about the relationship between Lady Macbeth and her husband. A really important thing when looking at these monologues is trying not to get bogged down and lost in the words. There can be a lot of words to say things that are really simple. If we look at those first few lines, was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself, and hath it slept since, and wakes it now to look so green and pale at what it did so freely? That is a lot of words just to say, where's your hope gone? You were hopeful before, and now you're scared. You look pale and green. You look sick with the idea of this. You were hopeful, now you're afraid. So it's a lot of words to say a very simple concept. And sorting out that it is saying such a simple concept is what helps us understand what we're saying when we are using these metaphors that Shakespeare uses within his original writing. So now let's look at the reason. Why is Lady Macbeth saying this? Well, we know from the context of the fact that he was hesitating, and from what we understand of the meaning of the monologue, that she's criticizing him being a coward. Why, though? What is it that she wants? What does she get from criticizing him in this way? When it comes to reasons like this is really up to interpretation, how you understand the character, and how you want to play this monologue. Your interpretation of it will vastly change how you read the monologue and the character. Some people see Lady Macbeth as a victim. Others see her as a villain, egging her husband on to do the terrible act of murdering Duncan. For me, I choose to operate under the idea that she is a villainous figure and she wants the power that she'll gain through her husband being king. Therefore, this monologue is to shame him into action. The reason why it's here, and what Lady Macbeth will get out of it, is if she can shame him to murder Duncan, she can gain power by being the wife of the king. Again, you could interpret this in nearly an opposite way and say that she's criticizing his cowardice, but in a way to try to encourage him against killing Duncan. There are multiple interpretations available, but again, for the sake of my analysis that I'm doing here with you, we're going to be saying that she is a villainous character and she does want him to commit murder. So now we need to look at the rhythm in the monologue. An important thing to know before you begin looking at rhythm and counting syllables in a monologue is if there is other lines around it that may justify it not having the 10-syllable count. This applies to this monologue for both the first line and last line. You'll notice that the first line, was the hope drunk, is only 4 syllables. That's because the line before it is a line from Macbeth that says not cast aside, so 6 syllables. 6 plus 4, 10. So when they were delivering those 2 lines, they would have said it as if it was one line. There wouldn't have been very much pause between the things the 2 characters were saying. We can see the same thing with the last line, where Lady Macbeth says, like the poor cat in the adage, which is 7 syllables, and Macbeth follows up immediately with the line, prithee, peace. He interrupts her to say, please be quiet. Please stop talking and going on the way that you're going on. So let's, before we continue counting syllables, see if we can look at some of the punctuation and get any hints from that. So we're going to be looking for pauses, commas being short pauses, question marks being raising inflections, semicolons being slightly longer pauses, periods being full stops. all of those things that you learn in your English grammar courses, right? So, was the hope drunk? No punctuation, continues directly into the next line. But at the end of this line, hath it slept since? We see the question mark, punctuation, before the next line. So we're going to find all of those commas, all of those question marks, and use them in reading the monologue. Was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself? Pause and raising inflection. Hath it slept since? Raising inflection, continuing with these questions. And wakes it now to look so green and pale at what it did so freely? Again, comma in the middle there. And wakes it now to look so green and pale. We have that little pause. From this time such I account thy love. Art thou afeared to be the same in thine own act and valor as thou art in desire? So again, we're questioning here, all the way from art thou to desire is one sentence, so we aren't pausing for those line breaks. From this time such I account thy love is one sentence, one whole thought, one whole idea. From now on, this is how I'll think of your love. From this time such I account thy love. That's it, that's one idea. And it continues on like that. We can look at all of the punctuation, where there's a comma at the end of a line, slight pause at the end of that line. Again, continuing through, getting those hints from the punctuation on when we're supposed to pause, when we're supposed to breathe. Because otherwise, if you tried to do this whole thing in one breath, you'd be struggling. But if you breathe too often, it messes up the rhythm. So those punctuation marks are going to give you a hint at how fast you're speaking as well. So now let's try counting the syllables and see if we can find any that are out of place. So either words with extra or fewer syllables than you'd give it naturally, how we pronounce it in modern English. Keep in mind that that may also be different between how you pronounce words and how I pronounce words. And then considering with these syllables and whether or not any lines are shorter than the 10 syllables they should be, seeing how that all is going to affect the emotion and the rhythm and the speed and all of these things when we're delivering the monologue. So, counting syllables. Was the hope drunk? 4 syllables. We know it's preceded by the 6 syllables that Macbeth says just beforehand. Wherein you dressed yourself, hath it slept since? 10 syllables. Yay! And wakes it now to look so green and pale. 10 syllables. At what it did so freely from this time. 10 syllables. If you're lost on counting syllables and you aren't sure how many syllables are in a word, an easy way to count them is to put a hand underneath of your chin. Each syllable is when your chin touches your hand. So, touches, we see it, touches my hand twice. Helpful little trick. Such I account thy love, art thou afeared, 10 syllables, to be the same in thine own act and valor, 11 syllables. Is there any word in this line that we can shorten to be only 1 syllable? Well, if we looked, all of the words in that line are already 1 syllable, except for valor. Is there any way we can, in modern English, pronounce valor as 1 syllable? Not really. So perhaps in Shakespearean English, there was a way to pronounce valor as only 1 syllable, but to us now it's valor, 2 syllables, which means we can use that to influence our rhythm and inflection on this line. So we know that act and valor is an important idea. It's important enough that it can go over that 10 syllable limit. As thou art in desire, wouldst thou have that? 11 again. But if we pay attention here, desire, or is it desire? So we can use what's called a triphthong, a 3-vowel sound, as the last bit of desire to make it only 2 syllables, bringing us to the correct 10-syllable count for this line. So we're not saying desire, we're saying desire. 2 syllables. Which thou esteemest the ornament of life, 10 syllables. But an important thing to note is the word esteemest. Esteemest. I'm pronouncing it as 2 syllables. You have to make sure you pronounce it as 2 so that it meets that 10-syllable mark. If you try to say it esteemest, you're going to end up with 11 syllables. So it's esteemest. And live a coward in thine own esteem, 10 syllables, letting I dare not wait upon I would, 10 syllables, like the poor cat in the adage, 7 syllables, but we know that prithee peace follows. So we know that that adds up to 10 syllables. Like the poor cat in the adage. Oh, I can't count. This is why it's important to take your time and do things. Like the poor cat in the adage. That's 8, and then it's pretty peace, which is 3. So, what can we do about this? How can we make it shorter? Like the poor cat, that's all 1-syllable words. We can't shorten those. In the, or either. If. Can we make in the into 1 syllable? Perhaps that's why there's a little apostrophe instead of an N there. In the adage makes it down to 7 syllables so that it can be followed by prithee peace and make 10 syllables. Absolutely wild the amount of thought that goes into making all of these the perfect da-dum, da-dum, heartbeat rhythm going through iambic pentameter. So now that we have all of these things and we've been thinking so much about this monologue, how do we put it all together? Well, we're going to make sure as we read it for the first time that we take our time, enunciate and pronounce the words, play with the intention. Again, is she a villainous character? Is she perhaps teasing him a little bit about being cowardly? Is she cruel to him? Or is she loving and sweet? Seriously, take your time. Don't rush your words. And remember, put your body into it. They would have used a lot of body language as they did these things. Don't be afraid to be bigger than you feel like you should. It's easier to tone it down from too big than it is to make it bigger when you're being too small. And trust me, it is nearly impossible to go too big. So I'm going to read this full acting style for you. And then after I'm done, you can pause it and give it a try a few times yourself, playing with the intention in a few different ways. So I'll read it once, then you can pause and read it as many times as you like. Then we'll be moving on to the next monologue and going through it a bit more briefly with you doing more of the work that I did this time around. So I'll read it, then you can pause and give it a shot. Was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself? Hath it slept since? And wakes it now to look so green and pale at what it did so freely? From this time such I account thy love. Thou art feared to be the same in thine own act and valour as thou art in desire. Wouldst thou have that which thou esteem'st the ornament of life, and live a coward in thine own esteem, letting I dare not wait upon I would, like the poor cat in the adage? So again, there's a lot of different ways you could read it. You could read it more teasing, you could read it almost flirty, you could read it cruelly. play with it for a little bit, pause the video, and then come back as we move on to the next monologue. Okay, hopefully you had a bit of fun there reading that monologue to yourself. The whole point of this, as well as getting practice and learning some things, is also to have a good time. So hopefully you are having fun here. We're going to be moving on to the next monologue, which is a very famous one that I'm sure you have all heard at least the beginning line to before. Hamlet's "to be or not to be, that is the question." So, I'm not going to lead nearly as much this time, but pose some of the questions and let you develop it further yourself. So, if you've read Hamlet before, let's think about the context. Remember, we're going through context, meaning, reason, rhythm. Context, meaning, reason, rhythm. So beginning with context. Have you read Hamlet before? This monologue comes in at Act 3, Scene 1. The context here. Do you know what it is? If you don't, how can you find it out? You can go, look online, look at Spark Notes, look up whatever you will, and read maybe the scene before, the rest of the scene before this, because this does come later in Scene 1. There are some stuff that happens at the beginning of Act 3, just before this monologue. Look at those and try to find the context. If you haven't read Hamlet before and don't necessarily have time to go doing a bunch of Googling right now, here's what I'll say for you. This is when Hamlet is now faced with the knowledge that his father was murdered by his uncle, and now knows that he should kill said uncle. Hamlet's world is falling apart around him, and he's questioning whether it might be easier to just die than keep on living. He eventually does decide to keep living because of the uncertainty of what happens after death, which scares him. Another interesting thing to note is that Claudius, his uncle, and Polonius, the father of Ophelia, hiding behind curtains inside the room. They are listening in on this monologue, and there's a chance that Hamlet might actually know that they're listening in on him. So, now that we've looked at the context, let's look at the meaning. Begin looking at the monologue line by line and seeking the meaning. Google "No Fear Shakespeare Hamlet," and you'll very quickly be able to find the Spark Notes website to see a modernized version of the text. You can navigate to Act 3, Scene 1, and click through the pages until you find this monologue. To be or not to be, that is the question. So we look at this, and we see the "No Fear Shakespeare" modernization, and we begin to understand that the monologue is about what? What do you understand from this? What do you understand from "to be or not to be"? What's he asking there with this question? What's he talking about when he says these slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, a sea of troubles, to die, to sleep, no more, all of these things? He's saying a lot of words here. What does it boil down to? What's the basic idea? Well, we know that he's asking the question, to live or to die? Is it better to live and suffer or to die? After we die, is it like a peaceful sleep free of heartache? Or is it a sleep in which we dream? And if we dream, what are those dreams like? Do they have suffering in their own? Go through this monologue and try to see and find any words or phrases that you don't understand. One that threw me off a little bit the first time I saw it was the rub. So here, the rub means the catch. So when he says, there's the rub, he's saying, that's the catch. That's the thing that makes death not as pleasant as it could be. That's the downside to this. Dream. We don't know what those dreams might be like. So go through and try to find which words highlight the most important aspects of the meaning here. So we're going to see suffering, we're going to see end them, to die, to sleep. End, to die, to sleep. Wishing for things, sleep of death, right? We're understanding there's this big comparison throughout this part of the monologue that says, is sleep like death? Is death like sleep? Is it worth it when we don't know what comes after? Oh, and by the way, the only reason why I must give us pauses in black text at the bottom is because you couldn't see the white text on the image. Sorry if that's confusing at all. So now we need to understand the reason. Why is he saying this? Obviously, he's thinking it through, but what does he gain from thinking this through? What does he gain from talking out loud to himself about this? And why did Shakespeare choose to show us it on stage? Nothing that Shakespeare put on his stage that's talked out loud is there for no reason. Everything serves a dramatic function. So what is the function of this monologue? What are we learning as an audience? And what is Hamlet learning as a character? Or if Claudius and Polonius are watching, does he know? Perhaps is the purpose of this monologue part of his act of madness. If he knows they're watching, it very well could be. And that interpretation comes down to changing how you, as an actor, will act the monologue. The rhythm. So again, look at the punctuation. Where are the pauses, the breaths? Where do sentences continue past line breaks? Where are there pauses at the end of line breaks? Where are there not? If you go through and count the syllables, is everything here 10 syllables? If it's not, why not? Should there be a pause there? How do the rhythms of the lines affect the emotion of the monologue? Do we know if he's speaking quickly? Do we know if he's speaking slowly? Do we know if this is a somber thought or one that comes from a rambling, nervous madness? Again, these things are up to interpretation and how you're going to play it, but the rhythm, the punctuation, the syllable count, these are the things that are going to give you a lot of hints as to how Shakespeare intended it to be read. Now that you've tried to answer these questions, you're going to get a chance to read it over out loud, try out different acting, different interpretations. Again, take your time, pronounce all the syllables and hit all the sounds. Once you've had a chance to pause the video and read it through a few times, I'll read it myself as well. But it is another important thing to know that as you're reading this is actually just a tiny snippet of the monologue. The actual monologue that begins to be or not to be, that is the question, is 3 times this length. Preparing to do a Shakespearean monologue or soliloquy when you're not used to it is a huge effort, but as with everything, it requires practice. I'm definitely still practicing it too. So take your time, look at it, and understand and imagine what it would have been like to see this sort of thing on stage. What holds your attention for a monologue that is several minutes long? Understanding these things and looking at the context, meaning, reason, and rhythm behind monologues is what's going to help you understand how to act Shakespeare and turn what seems like a grand and daunting task into something that's actually quite manageable, though sometimes time-consuming. So again, I'll give you time. Pause the video here and try out the monologue for yourself. Read it through a few different times and get to understand and feel the words in your mouth and feel how it happens. And here is my interpretation of the first lines of To Be or Not to Be from Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. To die, to sleep, no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. So yes, your interpretation was probably quite different from mine, and that is a good thing. Shakespeare can be performed over and over and over again for the fact that there are so many different ways to perform the very same things. And in the end, that makes the plays all the more richer and all the more interesting. So when you're approaching the Shakespeare monologue, if you look at the context, meaning, reason, and rhythm, it'll give you a lot of hints about how to proceed, and then from there it comes from your interpretation and your attempts at doing it over and over until you find the things that work well for you. Hopefully this has been helpful to you and given you a little bit of courage for the next time you feel like you need to read Shakespeare out loud in front of anyone else. Again, it's the kind of thing that requires a lot of practice, and I wish you all well in that effort. Goodbye, and I wish thee well.